Hey folks, George here. Today we've got something quite a bit different to talk about in terms of Japanese cultural artifacts. This time we're going to talk about a Japanese comic, or a manga, if you will, by a transgressive artist named Kago Shintaro. And his work, this short story, is called The Memories of Others. It's part of a greater anthology of his called Kasutoro Shiki, published in 2004. This short piece, and really all of Kago's works, are quite, I said it before, transgressive, but I find them quite interesting because they really bend and go to the limits of the medium of manga. And what does that mean? Well, that means that today, of all of the elements that I typically talk about, I want to talk about the structural and formal elements of the comic a lot more than I have in other sorts of discussions like this. So we are going to talk about how his use of the comic form is quite transgressive and in some ways can only be done as a comic, right? Can only be done as a comic. This work really only makes sense as a comic. It wouldn't make sense as a literary work. It wouldn't make sense as a film work or a cinematic work. But rather only as a comic. So we'll talk about that, I think, in great detail today. We'll talk about all the rest of the elements as well, though. So I will talk about plot, I will talk about characters, we'll talk about setting, and the themes of the work, along with, well, I already mentioned, the structural and formal elements, the intertextual connections, and the historical context that this work was written within, along with my own personal take on this. Well, I'll start with my own personal take. I usually don't start with my own personal take, but I will today because I've always, and this is just my odd sensibilities, my artistic sensibilities and my creative sensibilities are typically drawn to works that are rather transgressive and really push the boundaries of propriety, push the boundaries of what's acceptable, and really push the boundaries of what's really a piece of work, right? So in music, I like listening to a lot of avant-garde music. Of course, Arnold Schoenberg in the early 20th century, fairly transgressive, but even today in the 21st century, there's quite transgressive works. One of my favorite composers, John Zorn, for example, has an album where, you know, the people are really screaming. We could talk about other works that John Zorn has worked with, and other artists, musical artists that John Zorn has worked with in Japan, in a future video where I ponder musical aspects of Japanese culture. However, today we are talking about comics. Are there other comic artists who really push the boundaries of what comics are? Well, yeah, there might be. I'll talk a little bit about the British artist, the British comics artist, Alan Moore, who writes scripts for comics, things like that. One of his more famous works being Watchmen. Watchmen is a very transgressive work that really pushes the boundaries of what a comic is. Of course, when we talk a little bit more about Alan Moore, we'll see why Alan Moore is especially suited, despite the fact that they write completely different and disparate works. Why I think they are actually within the same family of transgressive artists. Cinema artists that I am particularly fond of in the American tradition, of course, might be David Lynch, who makes movies that are pretty far out. In the future, I hope to talk about a favorite Japanese cinematic artist whom I'm particularly fond of, named Sono Sion, who is really pushes the boundaries of propriety, at least, in cinematic artistry, in a different way than David Lynch does. But in any case, today we're talking about Kago Shintaro. And the reason that I am attracted to these works is because they really push the boundaries and make you question, what is this? How is this a comic? I've never seen a comic like this, and that's really what attracted me so much to this, and really is motivating me to dive quite a bit deeper today into his comics. Today, we'll just look at one very short piece that he's put together, but many of his other works as well really push what it is to be a comic book. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. Before we get to all that, let's talk about some of the simpler ideas in the memories of others. Kago has written a story and created a story where it's fairly simple. A girl, protagonist, that we, the reader, follow, has developed an illness. In this case, the illness is called panelitis. We'll talk about that in a little bit, right? She's developed this illness that gives her the power and the ability to see other people's history or memories, so to speak. Of course, the story is called The Memories of Others. So she can see other people's memories and what sort of ramifications that makes in society at large, especially since many of us have memories that we might not want to be made public. I know I've got a couple of those memories that I hope people can't see as I'm walking around, right? And he takes this to a maximum limit, which drives people crazy, drives people to suicide, breaks up marriages, causes other sorts of terrible effects, and of course, by the end of the story, drives the protagonist insane. So then, plot fairly simple, but it's within the manner that Kago explores this special power, seeing other people's memories, and how he explores it, both in the social context and historical context, but also within the comic context as well. That makes this such a magnificent work, in my estimation, yes? Let's talk about the setting for a little bit. Really quickly, we can see that it's some neighborhood in Japan, typical town where people live, right? There's a nice little community. Some people know each other, other people don't know each other, and that's it. Why is that interesting? Because, as I've already said, the protagonist goes crazy at the end. And by the way, she's not the first character in this text who loses her mind or goes crazy. So many of these normal people lose their minds and go off the deep end, so to speak. Some commit suicide, which might cause us to reflect on the problem of suicide in any society, but here in Japan, and why Kago is addressing that problem and telling a story where suicide is a manifest problem in society. The character, then, is a run-of-the-mill female protagonist. Nothing special about her except on the very first page, she starts the very first page by saying, "Oh my goodness, I've got panelitis." What does that entail? Now we're going to talk about, the structural and formal elements of this comic. Well, when we talk about comics, how comics might be different from other mediums, such as literature. Literature is typically text only, right? Movies are images, a sequence of images, and collected together, edited together in a moving manner. So we see a moving image in cinematic works. Comics don't move, but they're also multiple sequences, multiple images sequenced together. So kind of halfway between movies and halfway between text, especially since comics do have images, comics do have text, literary text, words. Yet the images don't move in the same way that they move in a cinematic work. Yes, now there are, very avant-garde cinematic works where the images don't move quite as much either. In any case, it is a feature of the comic, it seems to me, in my own estimation, that the images, the sequence of images, are still in a way that sequences of images in a cinematic work are not still, right? Of course, then somebody's going to pop in and say, yeah, but what about modern or brand new digital comics where they do actually animate, let's say? Well, if you push me against a wall and force me to answer the question, is this a comic? I might be apt to say no, personally, right? That it's something else if there is an animated moving image in a comic, right? In any case, the key way then that a comic portrays a sequence of images is what's called a panel, right? A little square that has an image. Next square or rectangle or some other shape has another image, and we read those sequences of images in a specific order, ideally. So what is panelitis then? The protagonist in this story develops a disease such that her sequence of images, her squares, her comic squares that will ultimately follow her around. And it's not just her who develops this panelitis, but everybody in the narrative has this disease where everybody can see the squares of your previous actions, your previous moments in your life. What does that mean? That means as you walk around, you will see other people's squares, and that's exactly what happens in this comic, right? That's, to me, a fascinating way to draw this work as a comic. As a comic. No other works, cinema, do not have panels. So the notion of a moving panel following you around, that's not how cinema works, right? Movies don't work that way. Movies aren't traditionally made that way. Whereas comics are, a panel is the essential element, one of the essential elements of a comic work. As such, this disease, this work, can only work as a comic, right? It cannot work as a literary work because as we see her panels following her around, I don't even know what that would look like. Now let's move from cinema to text-only works, let's say a novel, prose, fiction. What would that even look like in prose? Just words following you around, except the problem, of course, is that in a prose work, there aren't images anyway. So what is really following you around? You could tell the story that people can see your memories, right? You can verbally speak this story so that the listener or the reader understands that this is happening. But the experience of hearing such a story or reading such a story is radically different from seeing it on the page in front of you, where you literally see the memories of each person as they walk by, right? And that's the magic of the comic here. And that's why, again, this work can only exist as a comic. Now, earlier I mentioned an intertextual connection with the comics artist, the comics creator, Alan Moore. Right? I'm using the word artist as a broad term, as a creator sort of thing. Of course, Alan Moore mostly sticks to the scripting of comics, not necessarily the visual the visual art of a comic, but rather the narrative elements of a comic. Alan Moore is quite shunned amongst comics artists, and especially in the industry, especially by the bigwigs in the industry, because he's hated every single movie that was adapted from one of his original comics. And one of his arguments for this disdain that he expresses is, my works were made to be comics. If I wanted to make a movie, I would have made a movie. But my works are made to be comics. And when you turn a comic into a movie, you have something radically different, and that's not mine. And he's asked many times, take my name off of those movies. That's not my movie. Take my name off of it. What I write is comics. Now, this some people would be proud to have their comic made into a movie, but not Alan Moore, because he's strict by saying, I make comics. And those of us, this isn't going to be a discussion about Alan Moore's Watchmen, but Alan Moore's Watchmen, again, you could really see how, especially in Watchmen, it really only works as a comic. And there's so many layers of that work that only work as a comic, right? The layout of the page is so important in that work. And that idea, that work, that craftsmanship that Alan Moore devoted to the work Watchmen is work and craftsmanship that was devoted to a comic as a comic. A comic as a comic. Not a comic as a story. Because a comic as a story can be adapted to any other medium. You can adapt it to a movie, turn it into even a prose literature, turn it into an animated film. But a comic as a comic cannot be so adapted. And Alan Moore has been very vehement in his opposition to his works becoming movies or being adapted into movies, because I didn't make a movie, I made a comic. Why did I do that little tangential detour on Alan Moore? Because I feel like that's the thinking that Kago Shintaro brings to his own works. And certainly we could see that in this work, The Memories of Others. This work can't be a movie. It is uniquely a comic. Now, many people are going to push back and say, oh, how about if we put a picture-in-picture in a movie? Except that's not how movies work. When's the last time you saw a movie with a picture-in-picture? And how do you see all these panels of movies following you behind you? That only works as a comic, because in comics we are accustomed, those of us who are accustomed to reading comics, we are accustomed to reading panels, and even sometimes seeing panels in panels. And Kago exploits the medium in a brilliant way by only saying, I'm going to devise an imaginary disease called panelitis, whereby the viewer, the reader, can see the panels that previously explained this particular character's life, moments in this character's life. How else does Kago really exploit the medium of comic? Well, I'll talk a little bit more about the rather transgressive narrative elements of this story, typically around sex, right? Sex and even rape, which is plays a fairly prominent role in this story. Yes. However, how does Kago portray certain sexual and play with certain sexual tropes in Japanese comics, right? Well, there is a scene or a sequence of images where the protagonist says, oh my goodness, since everybody else can see my panels, I want to make it look like I need to mix my panels up so that people can't tell that I'm having sex with this character, because I'm ashamed of having had sex. I'm ashamed of having been, in fact, raped by this character. How can I exploit my panelitis so that people can't tell the difference between the panel of me having sex versus something else? Well, Kago quite brilliantly exploits another formal quality of comics, specifically Japanese comics, and that is this black censor bar. This black censor bar that does play such a prominent role in sexually explicit comics from Japan because of certain censorship laws. Genitalia, for example, cannot be portrayed in Japanese comics. So Kago exploits this feature, this odd quirk of Japanese comics, namely this black censorship bar. And the protagonist here says, I'm going to do something that looks like a black censorship bar. I'm going to eat a piece of seaweed paper. And by the way, how does he portray the seaweed paper? As a black censorship bar, just a blacked out square, a blacked out rectangle. And she eats it. Now, why does she eat it? Because and you see how Kago portrays her eating this seaweed paper in a very sexually seductive way, is sexually suggestive way, right? And it almost looks as though, for people who are accustomed and trained and used to reading Japanese comics with black censorship bars, it actually looks like the protagonist is performing oral sex behind the black censorship bar. Nope. It's seaweed paper. It's not actually a censorship bar. I'm exploiting that so that, by the way, while I was being raped, I know that there were black censorship bars. So now I want to use that black censorship bar to my advantage, so the protagonist says. But what's interesting there is the genius, the ingenuity of Kago. How can I use a black censorship bar in a creative way? And here, he brilliantly exploits this formal element, this formal quality of Japanese comics to say, look at this. It's not what you think it is. You think you're seeing something. Nope, it's not what I'm doing. I'm just eating seaweed paper. And that's just one of the ways that he exploits the formal qualities of the actual medium of comic books. And I am just blown away. Just blown away. This is, again, why I love Kago as an artist, as a creative mind so much. But of course, Kago doesn't stop there with his exploitation of certain formal elements of the comic. There's another page where the protagonist meets a stranger and says, wait a second, how did you hide your past so well? How did you hide your past? Look, all of your panels that follow you around are all hidden. They're black. I can't see your past. And what does the other character say? I never turn on the lights. This person lives in the dark, so to speak. All of the panels that follow this person around will be black, right? Or blacked out, completely dark. Now, what's interesting, those of us who know a little bit about art, a little bit about photography, we will recognize, and we've noticed, that total blackness almost never happens. Total blackness never happens in real experience. I mean, even if you close your eyes tight, don't you see? I mean, I'm looking right now, just closing my eyes. The way I squeeze my eyes a little bit, I see different shades of red and pink, actually, because I see the light coming through the skin of my eyelids, right? Even in the middle of the night, there's a little bit of light, such that you can kind of see shapes, so you don't stub your toe while you're walking to the bathroom in the total dark, although you don't see everything, so sometimes you do stub your toe. But in real life, there's very rarely total blackness. However, in comic books, especially in Japanese comic books that are black and white, total blackness makes perfect sense. Blacking out a square completely with just black ink makes total sense, despite the fact that that never happens in real life, even if the lights are always off, as the character in the comic says. And that, again, exploits a very specific feature of this very specific medium, comics. And Kago, again, brilliantly exploits that. The last interesting way that Kago really exploits the medium of comics, right? Well, he's already said panelitis. He's already given us this sort of formal exploration into the medium. But on the last page, I've interpreted the last page to read, to tell that the protagonist character goes crazy. And why do I say that? Because if we look at the last page, the shape of her panels is a spiral, right? It's like a spiral just spinning out of control. I think Alfred Hitchcock really exploited this in Vertigo, right? This spiral form really gives us that sense of insanity, that sense of losing your mind. And as a matter of fact, she even says at the end, they're mixing up all my panels with other people's panels. It's madness. So yeah, sometimes an artist has to spell it out for us, doesn't he? And actually say it's madness. Just the way he lays out the panel in a spiral of psychoses really sells to us the madness that our protagonist is feeling here. Now, one thing that I do want to talk about is this intertextual connection that I think Kago Shintaro has with not just other works, other manga works, other comic works that really exploit violence, really illustrate violence in this grotesque way. And not just grotesqueness, but eroticism too, and nonsense, or madness in this case. And so there's this genre, if you will, of contemporary Japanese comics called Ero-Guro-Nansensu. or erotic, grotesque nonsense. Yeah. And why make such erotic, grotesque nonsense? Well, before we answer that question, let's back up, because the first, we could say, movement of Ero-Guro-Nansensu goes all the way back to the early 20th century during the Taisho era, right? Now, clearly, Taisho Japan is radically different from 21st century Japan and late 20th century Japan. But there might be some similarities. One of the most prominent Taisho era writers of Ero-Guro-Nansensu is Ero-Guro-Rampo. And what Ero-Guro-Rampo writes about is this ultra-grotesqueness that is just under the veneer of society. One of my favorite stories that I will hopefully discuss in the near future is his story Caterpillar, which is about a soldier who comes back from war, but terribly disfigured, completely powerless over his own body. And what does that mean? What does that remind us of? Now, of course, this is in the prelude. The Taisho era is this sort of prelude, or, in the midst of, rather. Not so much a prelude, in fact, but in the midst of Imperial Japan and how Imperial Japan was going to war and not just hurting other nations. But Ero-Guro-Rampo wants to remind the reader, the Japanese reader, that Japanese people are being hurt by these imperialist goals as well, militaristic imperialist goals. Clearly, we don't have that motivation in the early 21st century with these manga artists who are creating these erotic, grotesque, nonsense works. So what is their motivation then, and what is the similarity? Well, I think the similarity is that they are illustrating eroticism, grotesqueness, and nonsense, absurdity, in order to show us and remind us that just beneath the veneer, just beneath the surface of what we see, there is all of these taboos that turn a lot of us off. Well, make people like me. I shared at the beginning of this discussion that I actually am attracted to these sort of taboo works and these transgressive sort of works. But many people are turned off by them, aren't they? Many people might have read or engaged with these works and been quite offended by the sensibilities expressed here. Why offend? Why offend? I guess that's the question. Why make a work that offends people, that pushes against taboos? And I think the answer to this question is, as we look at this work a little bit deeper, The Memories of Others, is to remind us that I want to push against your taboos because your taboos are actually making the society worser by calling them a taboo. Maybe what we should be doing is a little bit of self-reflection. And instead of calling self-reflection taboo, we might actually heal what ails ourselves and what ails society. But instead, you're putting these rules in place such that we can't even discuss certain things. And what happens when you can't discuss certain things? Well, I'm no psychoanalyst, but I heard of this cat named Sigmund Freud, who said what happens is we repress those things, and then they express themselves at a different stage of life as a neuroses of some sort or another, quite literally driving us mad. And that's the motivation, I feel, that these transgressive artists are bringing to the table. To remind us, we've all got these taboo sort of sensibilities. Why are we pushing it down? Because pushing these taboos down might lead to madness. And, by the way, if we do push these taboos down, we get economic bubbles and societies that burst. And we create societies that go mad. We get societies that can't deal with the challenges around them, as we see in 1995, and as the early Ero-Guro-Nansensu artists saw in the Taisho period, in the lead up to World War II, and the disasters that those caused. So now, perhaps some of these Ero-Guro-Nansensu artists are noticing and recognizing that, hey, might there be another disaster just looming? We want to expose these sorts of things to protect society, really. Yes, shock society, but maybe shock us into looking in the mirror and self-reflecting a little bit and considering, wait, is this okay? And that is, for me, the value of such transgressive artists. Now then, let's segue from there into themes. We've expressed that by the final page of this comic, our protagonist has gone insane, or is at least mad, experiencing some terrible psychosis. Why is Kago making a comic about an insane protagonist and a society around her that goes crazy, right? Where marriages are breaking up and thus leading them to suicide, where strangers on the street rape people who pass by. Why is he making a comic about so many people who experience such terrible psychoses throughout? Well, I've already expressed that in the year 2004, when this is published, Japan has long left behind the economic boom of the post-war era, really exemplified, where it really hit its peak in the 80s, 1980s. By the middle of the 90s, the economy had stagnated to a terrible degree. The bubble bursts, and all the brilliance that the Japanese thought about their own society, all the pride, let's say, that Japanese thought about their own society vanishes in the air as this bubble bursts. What else happens, though? Many people will like to say and like to make the demarcation point of the 90s and just say the early 90s is when the bubble bursts. Yeah, and perhaps that's true, right, when we look at the economic scales. However, I like pushing that line of demarcation, that watershed year, so to speak, actually into the middle of the decade, into 1995. Why? Because two key things happened in 1995 that might make Kago and others go crazy. The first is the Great Kobe Quake. Now, why does this Kobe Quake feel like such a watershed moment? Well, Japan has many of these earthquakes, great earthquakes, in their history. Great Yokohama earthquake of 1923 really seemed like a watershed moment, where there was before the earthquake and then there was after the earthquake. Very soon in the future, I hope to discuss the 3/11 earthquake in 2011. And that was actually an earthquake slash tsunami slash nuclear disaster. And again, there's before 3/11 and then after 3/11. And what I'm going to suggest, you don't have to buy it if you don't want to, but that 1995, this Kobe earthquake, at least plays a significant role in 1995, such that the bubble bursting, the economic bubble bursting, and this Kobe quake is just one more terrible thing that happens that makes Kago Shintaro and many other Japanese people lose faith. Why? Because up until then, through the economic bubble, in the economic boom times, I can imagine that many people in Japan felt invincible. Hey, look at this. Not only are we the second richest country on earth behind only the United States, But we are one of the most technologically advanced countries on Earth. And then what happens in 1995 with this Kobe earthquake? The Earth shows you and humbles you and puts you in your place and says, yeah, you thought you were technologically advanced? You thought you had everything in order? Let me show you what having everything in order really is like. And of course, the Kobe earthquake causes widespread destruction, despite the fact that many people had thought, oh, we know how to retrofit buildings, for example. We know how to protect ourselves so we can build tall buildings that won't fall in earthquakes. And the earth has a way of humbling us, doesn't it? By causing so much destruction in this 1995 earthquake. The other moment that helps me look at 1995 as a watershed year in Japanese history is this Aum Shinrikyo cult attack, the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway system. And again, it seemed like we Japanese, we Japan, this nation of ours, we are a sturdy nation. We are a safe nation. But underneath that veneer, many people were feeling empty, so empty that they joined a cult. Murakami Haruki wrote a nonfiction book, especially about this sarin gas attack. Coincidentally, he also wrote a book about the earthquake too, this 1995 Kobe earthquake, with many short stories. Both these events, Kobe earthquake and this Aum cult attack, reveal how vulnerable Japan really is. And maybe everything isn't held together quite so neatly as everybody thought. And after all, now let's bring this back to Kago Shintaro's The Memories of Others. Especially in light of the cult attack. This is a huge cult, many people. And it wasn't just many people who had joined this cult, but it's the number of highly successful people in the capitalistic way of measuring success. Lawyers, doctors, other professional folks who found professional success yet still joined this cult, this doomsday cult. And doesn't that reveal that, very similar to The Memories of Others, doesn't that reveal that, hey, there's a lot that we're not seeing in people? In a comic, I can draw the memories of others. Kago can draw the memories of others following you around. But in real life, this doesn't happen, does it? And by the way, if it did happen, might we actually be very surprised and maybe even go crazy ourselves? And that's why I'm interpreting Kago's motivation to illustrate this story, to tell this story as a comic in this way. That we're all just a few steps, perhaps, from madness. We're all just a few steps from joining a cult. We're all just a few steps from terrible violence. And yet we're all pushing this down and trying to hide it. Is our society, is our community, is our nation, is our world nurturing us enough to keep us from going mad? Well, Kago really exploits this medium of comics to suggest that maybe just beneath the surface, we're all just a few steps from being mad. If everybody could really be honest with ourselves and look at our own memories that are following us around. And perhaps with that realization, Kago is asking, maybe we should check all that just for a minute and realize our own vulnerabilities and how we can instead try to make the world a bit of a better place. See you next time.